FORA.tv. The world is thinking.
So, yeah, as you know, the famous quote is by Richard Nixon. He was being interviewed by David Frost a few years after he left the presidency, and Nixon said something along the lines, if the president does it, it's not illegal. I certainly don't agree with that. And actually, the Lincoln Emancipation Proclamation example, I try to use to prove my point. I mean, the president's power extends as far as, and here I don't disagree with Bob, we disagree where the line is, it extends as far as the power goes. So just because the president's commander-in-chief and we're in a war doesn't mean he could nationalize health care, right? It's not related to the fighting of a war. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves only in the areas of active fighting. Lincoln actually did not think he had the constitutional power to free the slaves in the North. And he was actually so worried about it that he really pressed for the enactment of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution while he was in office, because he actually thought when the war was over, he as president would have to return all the slaves to their owners. And so I think that's how I would think of it too, is that, you know, the president says commander-in-chief or to protect the country. He has the power, but it has to be reasonably related to what he wants to do. What Nixon's problem was that he was using his national security powers to follow his domestic political enemies who were completely unlinked to any foreign threat. Second,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Bob.
No, I don't want to interrupt that.
The second short answer is just given that's the line, presidents often, and Bob made his point in his talk, will cross that line. There's no guarantee we'll always have good people as president. We certainly haven't had good people all the time as president. I guess the question is, do you think you could write a legal code out in advance to bind the president down so that never happens at the cost of losing the flexibility that allowed Washington and Lincoln and FDR to succeed? I think I would rather rely on the political process. Congress to use its own powers in the midst of it to take care of it. Nixon, after all, is removed by the threat of impeachment. Andrew Johnson, who's fought with Congress about Reconstruction, is basically run out of office under impeachment. I think the political process actually does respond when people in Congress generally want to use those powers.
If I could just add and follow up to what just the immediate prior point that John was making, that he doesn't mean to say, and I certainly agree with him on this, that a president making decisions as commander-in-chief could not do whatever the president wanted. There has to be some relationship to him serving as commander-in-chief. The problem, though, is the way the current environment and the last two administrations, or certainly the prior administration, have defined the war on terrorism. There's very little that it wouldn't arguably reach, because the administration defines the so-called global war on terror as truly global. That is, there is no place on the face of the earth, or certainly in our country, that is not part of the battlefield. Anybody, any person is a potential terrorist, therefore anybody is suspect, and acts of terrorism, which are akin to acts of war in this scenario, could be virtually anything. Any act against a government official, any act against a government institution or building, or so forth, any act that involves violence or the threat of violence in an effort as part of a plan to change government policy becomes something that then could be subject to a president's very expansive definition or concept of serving as commander-in-chief, and therefore any communication might be, certainly would be reachable, for example. So as opposed to earlier conflicts in which I think the point John is making may have some currency, in the current environment, with this very expansive view of the so-called war on terror, there really is very little that a president couldn't reach in terms of having a very expansive view of serving and carrying out acts as the so-called commander-in-chief.